Just a caveat before we start, this paper doesn't really connect to any larger research agenda that I have. It just so happens that the associate pastor of the church, there I'm the senior, said we should do a series on the Ten Commandments. And so I said, well, then we need to have a sermon on why do we keep some Old Testament laws and not others. And that was the genesis of this paper. I'm going to be moving quickly because I probably have more here. I know I have more here than I can read in the time allotted, but we'll see what we get through. The question of which Old Testament ritual abstentions should continue to be practiced by Christians has been disputed from the inception of the movement. Jesus taught his followers to do all that God instructs in the Torah and the prophets. This requirement did not last only until Jesus realized his creative work on the cross. Jesus used the same until qualifier in parallel to teach that as long as heaven and earth exist, the need to follow the things commanded in the Old Testament will also exist. Thus, Christians ought to do even the smallest things that are written in the Old Testament until the entire process of salvation as anticipated therein is realized. Therefore, from the perspective of the Sermon on the Mount, the question is not whether Christians should continue to observe the abstentions of the Torah, but in what manner. This is perhaps most disputed among Christians when it comes to those abstentions in the Ten Commandments which enjoin rituals that regulate how humans relate to God, as opposed to those that regulate how we relate to each other. Should Christians continue to abstain from bowing down before images and from working on the seventh day, or observe the meanings of those practices in some other manner? To be clear, by, quote, rituals, I don't mean meaningless rote behaviors. I take rituals here to be practices, including acts of performance and abstention, by which we regulate our relationships with non-material reality, in this case, our relationship with God. What follows is a brief biblical case that Christians should practice certain abstentions as taught by the Torah for the sake of our relationship with God. First, we will consider how the apostles interpreted the continuity and discontinuity of Torah rituals by distinguishing those that, because of the work of Christ, are observed by Gentile Christians without practicing, from two categories of ritual abstentions that Gentile Christians should continue to practice due to the nature of the church. I'm going to skip that first section on continuity and discontinuity and things that are fulfilled in the work of Christ. We will find that the two categories that we should continue to practice because of the nature of the church overlap and have meanings that go back to terms established by God for humanity's relationship with him from our origins. When the Jerusalem Council was asked to settle the question of whether Christians need to be circumcised in the way that converts to Judaism do, it held that practicing certain Old Testament ritual abstentions, all of which applied to foreigners residing in Israel, continued to have meaning for Gentile Christians. It specifically enjoined abstention from things offered to idols, consuming blood, which includes eating meat from animals slaughtered by strangulation, and sexual immorality. It did not rule on what rituals should or should not be performed on the sexual organs of Gentile Christians, but it was clear about what Gentile Christians should not do with their sexual organs. Also note that the Jerusalem Council did not consider Sabbath observance a disputed practice along with circumcision. Rather, James argued without qualification or caveat that Gentile Christians should continue to observe the aforementioned abstentions because they had already had ready access to Torah instruction on Sabbath. And from that Torah instruction, they would have learned which ritual abstentions foreigners residing in Israel were to practice. Thus, given that the church started as a minority Jewish community into which Gentiles were rapidly integrated, which for James had eschatological significance, and given that Paul anticipated a continuing eschatological integration of Jews into the church, it is most plausible that the apostles turned to the Torah's instructions for resident foreigners living among the community of Israel in order to settle the circumcision dispute. The list in the Jerusalem Council's letter followed the same order as the instructions for resident foreigners that were given in Leviticus 17 through 18. According to Leviticus 17, 8 through 16, resident foreigners were to abstain from offering sacrifices anywhere but the Lord's meeting tent, which effectively prohibits idolatry, and from consuming blood. And in chapter 18, which is a speech from the Lord to Moses for the Israelites that lists prohibited sexual acts, verse 26 extends these prohibitions to resident foreigners. According to the Torah, resident foreigners were to receive the same annual instruction in the law as Israelites, which is consistent with James's expectation that Gentile Christians had been similarly instructed. In addition to ritual performances, there were ritual abstentions that resident foreigners were to practice beyond those specified in Leviticus 17 through 18. Leviticus 20 verse 2 penalizes resident foreigners who practice the idolatrous Moloch sacrifice, and Leviticus 20:10 and Deuteronomy 5:14 specify that foreigners who live with Israelites are to be afforded Sabbath rest. Finally, resident foreigners were penalized for blasphemy and murder. Abstaining from murder, while not a ritual as stipulated in this research, is related in terms of its salvation historical origin to the meaning of abstaining from blood. To consider the place of these other abstentions in the church, it is also helpful to consider the origins of their meaning, to which we now turn. The Torah does not present its instructions as an abstracted, decontextualized law code, but rather as a way of living that makes sense within a meta-narrative frame that is itself Torah instruction. Thus, the story of human origins followed by the story of Israel's origins is the background against, or a background I wrote, a background against which we can interpret the significance of the ritual abstentions we are considering. And within that story, we find that the rituals that the Torah commanded non-Israelites residing in Israel to observe had a continuity with terms established by God for our common progenitor's relationship with him long before he distinguished his covenant nation from the rest of the nations via circumcision. God established from humanity's inception that humans, both male and female, and not idols, are the image of God. God blessed this male-femaleness with fertility and established that individual male-female counterparts be conjoined in an exclusive, indissoluble procreative union, from which sexual immorality deviates. Then God set apart the Sabbath day as their blessing. God set up 2 trees in Eden, bearing fruit unto life and death, showing that matters of dietary abstention can have profound meanings for humanity's relationship with him. Diet became connected to the meaning of life and death again under God after the flood, when God gave humanity's second progenitors, Noah and his family, meat to eat, but commanded them to abstain from consuming blood and to penalize murder out of a respect for the God-givenness of life. Abstaining from blasphemy does not, as far as I can tell, originate in terms established by God with Adam's or Noah's family. Rather, it seems to have become relevant after God reintroduced his personal name, Yahweh. You can find that name coming up in Genesis 4:26 when people first call on the name of the Lord, and then it gets reintroduced to Moses in Exodus 6:3. Although abstaining from blasphemy was not enjoined by the Jerusalem Council, it was taught by Jesus and Paul. Therefore, the Jerusalem Council did not provide an exhaustive list of ritual abstentions that applied to resident foreigners living in Israel, nor an exhaustive list of which rituals Christians were to continue to practice. Rather, the broad New Testament application of the Torah's instructions for the resident foreigners indicates that Gentile Christians should continue to obey all such abstentions, and not only observe their spiritual meanings. In contradistinction, discontinuities in sanctuary, priesthood, and sacrificial worship practices across salvation history require some additional interpretive framework to discern their continuities of meaning, but that is not our concern here. The point which remains to be fully developed is that we do not find these kinds of discontinuities across salvation history with respect to the sinfulness of making images to worship, the respect due to God's name, the uniqueness of the seventh day, the exclusiveness of the male-female sexual relationship, nor the God-givenness of life as represented by blood. Worship, respect, uniqueness, exclusiveness, and God-givenness, these are all dimensions of holiness. Peter taught that Christians should deny their lusts or cravings and be holy, corresponding to God's holiness in every way of life, citing an expression from the Torah by which God gave the rationale for certain ritual abstentions that set his people apart from the other nations. Quoting now 1 Peter 1:16, "You shall be holy, for I am holy." Here, Peter quoted the latter of two nearly identical statements found in Leviticus 11:44-45 that enclose an instruction for Israel to abstain from a general class of unclean meat, that is, the swarming things. Verse 44 says, "Sanctify yourselves and be holy, for holy am I." And verse 45 says, "And be holy, for holy am I." The other unclean meats are classified in what precedes in Leviticus 11, a speech from God for Moses and Aaron to relate to Israel, which concludes with the reason for the ritual abstention from unclean meats. God's people's holiness should correspond to God's holiness. The speech concludes with a summary of the classes of unclean meat. Where the Jerusalem Council identified a category of Torah instruction according to which the church can be a community of Jews and Gentiles living together without requiring circumcision, Peter appears to have identified another category of Torah instruction that makes the church God's holy community without requiring circumcision. For Leviticus 11:44-45 is not the only instruction that shows God's people how to live in correspondence with his holiness. A nearly identical expression to that quoted in 1 Peter 1:16 occurs in Leviticus 19:1-4, which introduces a speech from God for Moses to relay to all of Israel in assembly. According to J.H. Hertz, this chapter occupies a central position in Leviticus, and thus of the Torah as a whole. Chapter 19's introduction is set off from the rest of the speech, first by the imperative, "You shall be holy, for holy am I, the Lord your God." It is further demarcated by the double enclosure of the practices that this entails with the refrain, "I am the Lord your God." This speech introduction enjoins the respect of parents, the observance of Sabbaths, and the prohibition of idolatry. These are given in reverse order of the Ten Commandments, which for Roy Gain can be interpreted as an intertextual chiasm. The Sabbaths in verse 3, taken in context of the preceding and following commandments, are not the annual festivals like Passover, but the weekly Sabbath as a recurring event, like in Exodus 31:13. The final Old Testament statement along the same lines is found in Leviticus 20:26. Be to me holy, for holy am I, the Lord, and I have separated you from the peoples to be mine. This is preceded in verse 7 of the same chapter by a similar instruction, but this time using the reflexive, "Sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am the Lord your God." Here in verse 7, the rationale of corresponding holiness, that is, "For holy am I," is not explicit, yet I don't think it requires repetition in view of the similar exhortations in 11:44 and 20:26. Leviticus 20 is a speech from the Lord for Moses to give to Israel about Israelites and resident foreigners abstaining from the Molech sacrifice, and Israelites abstaining from spiritualism, filial and sexual immorality. I've used this word filial as a shorthand. It essentially refers to the relationship to one's parents, okay? So filial immorality is what Leviticus 19 is talking about when you have to honor your parents. They're to abstain from unclean meat as well in this chapter. They are to do these things along with all the other instructions God gave to Israel because the Lord has made them holy by separating Israel from the other peoples. And so as God's possession, the people's holiness must correspond to God's holiness. In verse 26, the instruction to be holy is most closely associated by proximity with abstaining from unclean meat and spiritualism. In verse 7, it is most closely associated with the general instruction to follow the other Torah instructions and the specific instructions to abstain from spiritualism, filial immorality, specifically in this case, cursing one's parents. The instruction to abstain from the Molech sacrifice in 22-5 is a specific implication of what we already saw in 19 verse 4, which also has to do with corresponding holiness. And the instructions about abstaining from sexual immorality in 20:10-21 begin with the instruction to abstain from filial immorality, which is an implication of the command to respect one's parents in Leviticus 19:3. Thus, the subject of the whole speech in Leviticus 20 is national corresponding holiness. Like the resident foreigner instructions, the corresponding holiness instructions relate to meanings for humanity's relationship with God that go back to our origins. Filial and sexual immorality both violate the terms established for human fertility at creation. by associating filial and sexual immorality, as well as abstaining from blood and penalizing murder, the instructions for resident foreigners and corresponding holiness unite regard for God with regard for one another. I have isolated here ritual immorality in terms of our relationship with God for analysis because it is questioned with respect to the seventh day and images in our time as it was with respect to circumcision and idolatry in the apostles' time. But we should not overlook the unity of the moral outlook inculcated by the practices of the Torah, which cares for both kinds of relationships. For Peter, the whole church is a holy priesthood, a royal priesthood, and a holy nation, which implies that in the church there is no priestly clan with separate rituals because all are priests. Accordingly, Peter here quotes not "he, the priest, shall be holy." There's other corresponding holiness rituals for the priests in Leviticus 21, but Peter quotes "you," plural, "shall be holy." Thus, Peter's quote relates only to those ritual abstentions that make the people as a nation holy in a way that corresponds to God's holiness. The holiness code of Leviticus 17 through 26 is not therefore undifferentiated. It is uncontroversial to note that some of its instructions for Israelites were extended to resident foreigners. It is also uncontroversial to note that for first century Jews, as in 1 Peter 1:14, the holiness code required the denial of natural desires for the sake of holiness. But as we have seen, the ritual abstentions by which Israel was to correspond to God's holiness were distinguished from the other holiness rituals by a distinct introduction and distinct speeches. They were also distinguished from the rituals by which the priest corresponded to God's holiness, and that the national corresponding holiness issues relate to terms set by God for his relationship with humanity from its origins. There's stuff that the priest had to do, like not touching a corpse, for example. You can't really get that all the way back to Noah or to Adam and Eve. Therefore, the national holiness correspondence, ritual abstentions, formed a special subset of the holiness code that explained how Israel was to maintain its identity as God's holy nation. With the classification of these ritual abstentions clarified, we will find that there is a broad concord between the ritual abstentions enjoined and implied by the Jerusalem Council and those implied by the teaching of Peter about corresponding holiness of the church as a holy nation. One might infer from the fact that he does not set forth any specific abstention that Peter quoted Leviticus to transform the meaning of corresponding holiness such that Christians need not follow a certain class of Torah instruction. However, when received against the background of the Jerusalem Council's teaching, as opposed to the majority of later Christian tradition, it is more reasonable to conclude that Peter's "for it is written" and subsequent quotation were not a mere rhetorical flourish, nor was it narrowly intended to call to mind a specific ritual abstention like that from unclean meat. Rather, the overlap between the ritual abstentions called to mind in the exhortation, "Be holy, for I am holy," and those enjoined by the Jerusalem Council suggests that Peter's audience, already instructed in Torah, would have understood his quotation to imply the concord and continuity of a set of similar and related practices. And on this point, I have a handout that I will make available to some. I'm afraid I should have printed more, but we could pass this around. This is a chart that I'm going to be working off of. Thank you very much. Might be easier just to catch that at a glance. The concord between the resident foreigner and corresponding holiness abstentions is explicit in that, as previously noted, the prohibition of the Moloch sacrifice for resident foreigners was given in a speech dealing with corresponding holiness. That's in Leviticus 22. But categorized more broadly, these ritual abstentions were the same across 3 out of 5 dimensions each: idolatry, the Sabbath, and sexual immorality. In addition, both required dietary abstentions related to eating meat. Therefore, Peter's audience could easily have interpreted his teaching on the church as a holy nation to imply the continuity of practicing the corresponding holiness abstentions. For that church would only need to adopt an additional dietary practice and abstain from spiritualism. All three of the non-dietary practices were taught and implied by the Jerusalem Council, which placed no greater burden on the Gentiles coming to Christ than to abstain from idolatry, blood, and sexual immorality, because the Torah is taught every Sabbath. Although the penalty for spirit mediums was implied for resident foreigners in Torah instruction, the corresponding holiness rituals of abstaining from spiritualism and unclean meat were not explicitly applied to resident foreigners, unlike the Moloch sacrifice. Regardless, opposition to spiritualism by means of signs and wonders was a prominent feature of the apostles' ministry, not to mention that of Jesus Christ, and so evidently would not have been a matter of controversy at the time of the Jerusalem Council. Thus, it seems that by referring to the placing of a burden, the Jerusalem Council primarily addressed disputed practices. The presenting issue was circumcision, which was not a national corresponding holiness ritual. But sexual immorality and meat from idolatrous sacrifices were also topics of dispute, as evidenced in Galatians and 1 Corinthians 5, 8, and 10, 14 to 33, respectively, where Paul gives more detailed teaching than the Jerusalem Council on these matters. On this point, it is relevant to observe that in view of Paul's teaching that Christians can affiliate with demonic powers by eating food sacrificed to idols, whatever else Romans 14, 1-6 teaches, it should not be interpreted in a way that minimizes the ongoing need for Christians to abstain from certain foods. Thus, in the absence of other evidence to the affirmative, we should not assume that by teaching the Romans how to handle differences of opinion around unspecified observances involving food and days, Paul intended to portray resident foreigner and corresponding holiness ritual abstentions as matters of indifference. Rather, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, because Paul explicitly taught against idolatry and sexual immorality, we should assume that neither did he dissent from the Jerusalem Council's decision about abstaining from consuming blood. Like the other corresponding holiness rituals that were the same as those resident foreigners were to follow, abstaining from spiritualism and unclean meat is meaningful for humanity's relationship with God in terms that go back to our origins. As previously noted, dietary abstention had a specific meaning for humanity's relationship with God immediately following creation and in relation to the fall. But the distinction between clean and unclean meat, along with the blood, presumably became relevant as God was about to judge humanity and renew human origins through Noah and his family. Though animal sacrifice was practiced immediately after the fall, clean and unclean animals are not mentioned until they board the ark by 14s and 2s, respectively. This foregrounds the connection of clean animals as fit to eat, given that there was more than one breeding pair of clean animals available, as opposed to fit to sacrifice, without implying that sacrificing and eating are unrelated. They are very much related, as we saw in the previous paper. For after the flood, God would give humanity animals to eat at the first time. This interpretation that the commands given to Noah apply to all humanity is well represented in later developments in Jewish thought. And Jubilees 7, verse 20 holds that Noah taught his descendants to abstain from, among other things, uncleanness. Therefore, unclean meat may not have even been considered an option for food by many of those who were already observing the Torah's instructions to abstain from consuming blood and food that was associated with idolatry. Spiritualism also violates meanings for our relationship with God at our origins, in that its various practices all seek aid or guidance from spirits apart from the Spirit of God, who initiated the creation sequence that culminated in the creation of humanity, Genesis 1, 1-2. Thus, spiritualism ignores the instruction to have an exclusive relationship with our one true Creator God. While spiritualism does not require making and sacrificing to idols, like the Moloch sacrifice and idolatry in general, all such practices are expressions of infidelity that, according to Torah, violate the nation's relationship with God in a comparable way to the way sexual immorality violates the marriage relationship. In view of the broad overlap and interconnections between the resident foreigner abstentions and the corresponding holiness abstentions, it seems perhaps counterintuitively that a part of what set Israel apart by observing the corresponding holiness rituals was that these rituals were not originally intended for Israel alone. Because the meanings of the corresponding holiness rituals also relate to terms established by God for his relationship with the progenitors of all humanity and by extension their offspring, what set Israel apart by observing these rituals was apparently that they were the means by which God had restored abstentions that the other nations should have observed all along and were to come to admire as a result of Israel's witness. That witness was extended by the apostles' teaching that non-Jewish Christians should continue to practice certain Torah abstentions in order to distinguish the church from the rest of non-Jewish humanity. This salvation historical continuity indicates that the Jerusalem Council's letter was not a temporary stop on a trajectory towards abandoning most Old Testament ritual abstentions altogether, but rather it reflected a subset of a larger set of practices that should continue to regulate the church's relationship with God. In sum, the apostles discerned how the ritual abstentions that are meaningful for all humanity are distinguished in the Torah from other ritual practices that had meanings for God's covenant nation in terms of the promised Messiah, meanings that people of any nation observe without the need of ritual practice when they affiliate with Jesus Christ. By tracing how the apostles carved the Torah at its joints, apologies to Plato, we have found that it has instructions for specific overlapping ritual abstentions that 1. Applied to foreigners in God's covenant nation, 2. Made the nation correspond to God's holiness, and all of which, 3. Had meanings for our relationship with God that are in continuity with humanity's origins, with the sole exception of abstaining from blasphemy. Therefore, the apostles left us not only normative teachings about which Torah practices to continue and discontinue, they also left us a normative hermeneutical example to follow, or maybe a couple of examples, when similar controversies arise in contemporary Christian communities. More can and should be written about how the practice of ritual abstentions is realized by God's promise to write his Torah in our hearts. Much has been written about the moral meaning of the ritual abstentions recommended by this research, but there is more to be developed, particularly as regards dietary abstentions, which many find arbitrary. I also grant that, as with everything properly hermeneutical, qua Gadamer, the understanding of a practice is always determined by its implementation in a way that may make the force of the above evidence difficult to comprehend for Christians who did not abstain from, say, bowing down to images, from consuming blood, from sexual intimacy outside of heterosexual marriage, or from working on the seventh day of the week. Regardless, the teachings of the apostle in this regard can be expected to prompt reflection on how these abstentions can be practiced in a way that is meaningful for Christians today. At a minimum, the evidence from salvation history is sufficient to conclude that Christians who practice the Old Testament ritual abstentions that set apart Christ's church as a holy nation in which Gentiles reside with Jews, these are not Judaizers. They do not necessarily collapse the distinctions between Jewish and Christian identity. Rather, such Christians are brothers in Christ who have interpreted the Old Testament in much the same way as the Jerusalem Council and the Apostle Peter. Thank you.